For centuries, we thought syphilis arrived in Europe with Columbus's crew, returning from the New World in the late 15th century. It was a story that made sense, a deadly souvenir from a historic voyage. But what if that entire timeline is wrong? What if the disease was already lurking in the heart of medieval England, in a place you'd least expect it? Today, we're re-digging into a discovery that could rewrite the history of one of the world's most notorious diseases. It all started in the modern city of Hull in northern England. Before construction could begin on a new courthouse, archaeologists were called in for a routine excavation. What they found was anything but routine. Beneath the city streets lay the remnants of a 14th century Augustinian friary, a lost world frozen in time. They unearthed over 240 skeletons, along with a treasure trove of medieval artifacts. The preservation was simply stunning. Skeletons were found still resting in their wooden coffins, some still wearing their leather shoes. Delicate textiles and other personal items survived for over 600 years. It was a perfect snapshot of life and death in a medieval religious community. But as the team examined the remains, they noticed something disturbing. Many of the skeletons bore the marks of a terrible, infectious disease. One individual in particular drew their attention. He was catalogued as Skeleton 1216. Skeleton 1216 was a man, estimated to be between 25 and 35 years old when he died. His bones told a story of immense suffering. When renowned bioarchaeologist Professor Charlotte Roberts examined him, she immediately recognized the telltale signs of advanced venereal syphilis. His skull was pockmarked with a condition known as caries sicca, a dry, erosive scarring that gives the bone a worm-eaten appearance. His palate, the roof of his mouth, had a gaping hole in it, and his leg bones were bowed into a distinctive saber shin deformity. These are the classic, undeniable markers of syphilis. The shock wasn't just that one skeleton showed these signs. As the team looked closer, they found that over 60% of the individuals buried in the friary had similar traits. This was an astonishingly high prevalence rate, especially for what was supposed to be a celibate religious order. This one cemetery in Hull held more cases of pre-Columbian syphilis than had been found in the rest of Europe combined. The date was also crucial. These individuals died and were buried in the 14th century, a full 150 years before Columbus set sail. This discovery created a massive paradox. The site belonged to the Augustinian friars, a mendicant order whose members took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They were known for their charity work, their healing skills, and their devotion to God. So how did a sexually transmitted disease become rampant within their walls? The find raised profound questions, not just about the history of medicine, but about the moral and spiritual life of the friary itself. As archaeologists sifted through the graves, they found another puzzling object: small, bundled wooden rods placed beside some of the bodies. Initially, some wondered if these were instruments of perversion, hinting at a darker, secret life. However, experts soon identified them as flagellation rods, tools used for self-punishment. The friars, believing illness was a punishment from God for sin, may have been whipping themselves in a desperate attempt to atone and heal. Their pain was not a sign of deviance, but of extreme, misguided piety. But that doesn't fully solve the mystery. How did the disease get there in the first place? While the friars themselves took a vow of chastity, the friary wasn't an isolated bubble. It was a major institution in a bustling, wealthy port town. Hull was a hub of international trade, especially in wine from the Gascony region of France. The friary itself was deeply embedded in this commercial world. Evidence suggests these Augustinians were far from poor. They sold burial plots within their prestigious grounds to the city's wealthy elite. The richer you were, the closer to the altar you could be buried, ensuring your soul a speedier path to heaven. For a price, they sold funeral masses, prayers, and other spiritual services, accumulating significant wealth. This pursuit of profit may have led them to bend other rules as well. Did their vow of chastity also fall by the wayside? The friary wasn't just a place of prayer, it was a center of social and economic activity. It functioned as a guest house, a hospital, and a community hub. Merchants, sailors, and travelers from across Europe would have passed through its doors. The friars, who were also known for their medical skills, likely treated the sick from the surrounding city, a population exposed to diseases from all corners of the known world. The port of Hull was a gateway not just for goods and money, but for infection. It's possible the friars contracted the disease while tending to the sick, or that the skeletons belonged to wealthy patrons who bought their final resting place, bringing their worldly ailments with them. Or perhaps, surrounded by the temptations of a thriving port city, some friars succumbed to the very sins they preached against. The high rate of infection suggests the disease was spreading within this community, whether through sexual contact or, less likely, from mother to child among the lay population buried there. The case of skeleton 1216 and the Hull Friary is a bombshell. It forces us to reconsider the entire origin story of syphilis. The disease wasn't a New World import. It was already present in the Old World, quietly spreading long before Columbus. The friars of Hull, caught between their sacred vows and the secular realities of a medieval port, provide a haunting glimpse into this hidden history. Their suffering, etched into their very bones, tells a new story, one of faith, commerce, and a disease that has plagued humanity for far longer than we ever knew. As the bones were cleaned and examined, pathologists noticed something startling. The skeleton was riddled with distinctive and severe damage. The skull was pitted with lesions, a condition known as caries sicca. The tibiae, or shin bones, were thickened and bowed, showing signs of a severe inflammatory response. These weren't the marks of a common injury or arthritis. To the trained eye of a paleopathologist, the signs were unmistakable. This person had suffered from advanced tertiary syphilis. The discovery was shocking. Syphilis in medieval England? And not just in anyone, but in a high-status individual buried in a holy place. This find immediately posed a direct challenge to the long-held Columbian theory. But to prove anything, the archaeologists had to know exactly when this person lived and died. Dating ancient remains can be tricky, but in this case, the team had a stroke of luck. Skeleton 1216 was buried in a wooden coffin, and remnants of that wood survived. This allowed them to use a powerful technique called dendrochronology, or tree ring dating. By analyzing the unique patterns of the tree rings in the coffin's planks, experts could pinpoint the exact period when the tree was felled. The results came back, and they were staggering. The wood was dated to between 1340 and 1369. This placed the burial squarely in the mid-14th century. Let that sink in. This was over 150 years before Columbus set sail on his fateful voyage to the Americas in 1492. The implications were explosive. If this individual died from syphilis in the 1300s, it meant the disease was already present in Europe long before the so-called Great Discovery of the New World. To understand why this is such a bombshell, we need to revisit the traditional story. For over 500 years, history has confidently pointed the finger at Columbus's crew. The narrative goes that they contracted the venereal disease in the Americas and brought it back to Europe upon their return in 1493. The timing seemed to fit perfectly. Just 2 years later, in 1495, all hell broke loose. During the siege of Naples, a French army was suddenly struck down by a horrifying new illness. A German scholar named Joseph Grunpeck, who was there, wrote a terrifying first-hand account. He described a disease that began with sores and progressed to agonizing aches that felt like bones were being split apart. It caused grotesque rashes and pustules to cover the body, sometimes eating away the nose, lips, and other features, leading to horrific deformities and eventually death. The symptoms he described are a textbook match for severe, untreated syphilis. The disease spread like wildfire across Europe, and with it came the blame game. No one wanted to take ownership of this terrifying new plague. The Italians and Germans called it the French disease. The French, in turn, called it the Neapolitan disease. The English called it the Spanish itch, while the Russians blamed the Polish. It was a continent-wide game of passing the buck. But the connection to Columbus's voyage persisted, largely thanks to a Portuguese physician, Rui Dias de Isla. He claimed to have treated members of Columbus's crew for the disease upon their return, and explicitly stated that they had contracted it from the indigenous peoples of the Americas. For centuries, this account, combined with the 1495 outbreak, formed the bedrock of the Columbian theory. It was accepted as historical fact. For much of the 20th century, this theory reigned supreme. The scientific community largely agreed. A prominent supporter was the late anthropologist George Armelagos. He spent his career studying skeletons from the Americas and found abundant, clear evidence of syphilis in populations that lived and died long before any European contact. He argued that the lack of similar compelling evidence from pre-Columbian Europe was telling. If the disease had been in the Old World all along, where were the bodies? Why weren't archaeologists finding skeletons with the classic signs of syphilis predating 1492? His argument was powerful. The evidence was in the Americas, not in Europe. Therefore, the disease must have originated in the Americas. But other researchers, like British bioarchaeologist Charlotte Roberts, proposed a compelling counter-argument. She suggested that the absence of evidence isn't necessarily evidence of absence. Roberts hypothesized that if a milder, non-venereal form of the disease had existed in the Old World, it might not have left the same dramatic marks on the skeleton. People might have died from other causes long before the disease could progress to its advanced, bone-altering tertiary stage. Remember, life in medieval Europe was often short and brutal. Without evidence of those late-stage bone changes, the presence of the disease would be archaeologically invisible. This is what makes the Hull skeleton so monumentally important. Skeleton 1216 wasn't a case of mild early-stage disease. It displayed the full, unambiguous, and horrifying spectrum of tertiary syphilis etched directly into the bone. It was the smoking gun that researchers like Roberts had been looking for. The strongest piece of physical evidence yet that the disease was indeed present and severe in the Old World long before Columbus. But in science, extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. The dendrochronology date from the coffin was compelling, but it wasn't definitive proof of the skeleton's age. Critics of the pre-Columbian theory rightly pointed out a potential flaw. What if the person was buried much later, but in an old, reused coffin? It was a long shot, but a valid scientific question. To silence the doubters and confirm the age of the bones themselves, there was only one thing to do: radiocarbon dating. The stakes were incredibly high. If the carbon dating confirmed the 14th century timeline, it would lend immense weight to the theory that syphilis was a native European disease. If it showed the skeleton was from after 1492, the discovery would be dismissed and the Columbian theory would stand. Samples from skeleton 1216 were carefully packaged and sent to one of the world's leading laboratories for analysis, the Oxford Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit. The entire debate hinged on the results from that lab. The scientific community and indeed the history books held their breath. The results came back from Oxford, and they were conclusive. The radiocarbon dating confirmed that skeleton 1216 had died between 1300 and 1450. This corroborated the tree ring dating perfectly. The man from Hull had indeed lived and died from syphilis decades, possibly more than a century, before Columbus ever set foot on a ship bound for the Americas. This discovery sent shockwaves through the fields of history and archaeology. It suggests a new, more complex story for syphilis. Perhaps a milder, non-venereal form of the disease existed in both the Old and New Worlds for millennia. Then, in the late 15th century, something changed. The crowded, unsanitary conditions of rapidly growing cities, combined with the social upheaval of the era, may have caused the bacterium to mutate into the more virulent, sexually transmitted form that exploded in Naples in 1495. So, Columbus may not have introduced the disease itself, but the social conditions of his time may have been the catalyst for its terrifying transformation. The story of skeleton 1216 proves that history is never truly set in stone, and sometimes the dead have one last story to tell. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey back in time. What do you think? Does this discovery change your view of history? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. We'll see you in the next one.